All right. Welcome. Welcome to another round of Sit and Sip with Dr. Megan Rose. That's me. And in this series of talks, we've been diving into this topic of spirit marriage, which I've been studying for almost 20 years now. And I am super excited because for those of you who've come to my last few Sit and Sips or the ones last fall, they were mostly me talking. But tonight we have a special guest. Yay. So thank you for coming back again and again and watching these. And for those of you who this is the first time you're watching, welcome. This is week 4 out of a 6-week series that is arisen out of my research into esoteric spirituality and religion and my practice as a practitioner scholar of those traditions. So just a quick reminder, please turn off your Zoom video and mute yourself until the Q&A time at the end. And that's just going to help with recording this recording for folks who are watching this as a replay. So video and audio off, and then we can turn them all on at the end and see each other and talk to each other. So today we're going to go for about an hour, and then at the end I'm going to share some exciting news, so stay tuned till the very end. And as always, I'm going to stay on at the end, and Caroline has agreed to stay on for a little while as well so that we can answer any questions that you have about what we're going to talk about today. So for those of you who are new to this series, I'm Dr. Megan Rose, and I have a doctorate in psychology from the California Institute of Integral Studies, and I have a master's degree in religion from the Graduate Theological Union. I'm also an initiated ceremonial magician, a Shakta Tantric practitioner, and I'm a senior apprentice in the House of Bree Fairy Seership Institute. And tonight, as I mentioned, we have a special guest, Caroline Kenner, whose story, The Washington, D.C. Witchdoctor, appears in my book, Spirit Marriage, which is coming out in April. So here is a little bit about Caroline, and then we're going to dive in. Caroline Kenner was born in Washington, D.C., where she was a visionary healer, a witch, and a pagan community organizer for 30 years. She has received ceremonies in a variety of religions, including Tibetan Buddhism, Cuban Santería, Witchcraft, and Norse Heathenry. Having been involved in the East Coast Pagan community since 1987, she's an outspoken activist for working for pagans' rights. Excuse me, I'm going to say that again. She's an outspoken activist working for pagan rights, women's rights, and the environment. Caroline was instrumental in getting the Pagan Pentagram, or the 5-pointed star, included as an accepted symbol by the Veterans Administration to be used on federally funded military grave markers and plaques. Caroline is a graduate of Bryn Mawr College and also has a master's degree in political broadcast communications. Welcome, Caroline.
Thank you very much for having me.
So happy that you're here. The last time we spoke, gosh, I think it was when we did the interview, which was, a while ago now. So it's wonderful to see you back here in person. I don't even think we saw each other in person when we did the interview, right? It was on the phone. So It's great to see you live virtually.
Thank you. I've moved to Olympia, Washington since we did the interviews together. So it's been a big change for me.
Yeah, right. That was a big shift between being in DC for 30 some odd years.
50.
30, yeah.
50.
Yes. Pardon?
50, more than 50 years.
Oh, 50 years.
I was born in DC and I'm 65 and I spent time away getting educated.
Okay.
Otherwise, I was in DC.
Wow. Okay. So when the 30 years is all of the organizing and things that you were doing.
Correct.
Got it. Got it. So tell me a little bit about the Witchdoctor. What, because the title is the Washington, D.C. Witchdoctor. What does Witchdoctor mean to you?
So one of the things that's happening in visionary work is that the indigenous societies that provided us with guidance in the beginning stages of learning how to do visionary work with spirits, because I'm a student of Michael Harner and Sandra Ingerman. So they called it shamanism, which is what it's called in all kinds of anthropological textbooks going back to the earliest days of the 20th century. So, but now that word has become charged and considered appropriative by many people. So after, thinking about it for quite some time, I decided the best word for me was witch doctor, because it's the traditional English word for what I do, or what I did, because I'm mostly retired at this point. Basically, when I was working as a healer, I sang. I would sing, and a whole lot of spirits would come. Friends in ceremonial magic have told me that some of the ways that I conjure a ceremony, how I build to a climax in the ceremony in terms of when the different spirits are called, what order they're in, and who they are, is similar to some of the ceremonial magicians' ways of doing things. But the point is, there were songs beginning at the source of all and ending in a complete cosmos. So by the time I finished singing, I had an audience because they all wanted to hear what happened next. And that's part of the reason I've worked with multiple spirits so much, because honestly, in our day, we have illnesses that didn't exist before because we've caused them ourselves. So, the kind of heart sickness that Western civilization gives rise to is, you need a committee. It's not just a single god or a single ancestor who's going to be able to help you.
Yeah, not to mention that, like, the land that we live on has had so many different people and waves of, the indigenous folk, and then the waves of immigration, that it seems like there's like a whole stellium, right? A whole pantheon of folks that are hanging around, right?
Right, I agree with that. I actually spoke at a witch convention about a year and a bit ago about spirits of place, because Americans don't understand spirits of place very well, because we started as invaders, and then basically the Western capitalism is a rape of the land. So that's been our relationship with the land for most of the time European Americans have been here.
Yeah. So
So
we have to, when we work with these other, and I talked about this in my sit and sip last fall, when we work with the other world, I think one of the first things we have to do is get right with both our ancestors and then also the spirits of the land, because we
I
carry
agree with
both of
that.
those. Yeah.
Totally agree.
I'm gonna read a little something from the book that's connected to this.
Sure.
Look, folks, my book arrived. Like, I just unboxed it like a couple hours ago, and I've already started, flagging stuff to read. I'm super excited that I get to read from the actual book tonight and not my dissertation. So here's what I got me kind of excited about the ancestry piece of this. So that being said, Caroline emphatically states that she loves and honors all the pantheons and is also dedicated to a variety of non-European deities. In fact, she first dedicated herself to the Egyptian goddess Nephthys at the age of 9, and her first encounters were with the pantheons of Greek, Egyptian, and African diaspora deities. And then we go on, and it's and I say, this multi-pantheon path, Caroline admits, has made her experience as a pagan a bit more complicated. And then this is what you said, Caroline. You said, I look like a nice suburban lady, but my mom took me to all these places full of death, in Rome when I was 7, and to Pompeii, where I saw the death, agony rictuses of all the people with plaster casts. She took me to the catacombs and to a church with the monks' bones on the walls. I have a collection of skulls carved from stone mostly. I really like Samhain. I just resonate with the divinities of death. I also belong to the Morrigan, so at all times I'm balancing the Orishas, the Morrigan, Freya, and Nephthys at a minimum. I hear them all. Caroline observes that her spirituality is also based on growing up in the highly cosmopolitan and multicultural Washington, D.C. area, where virtually every country in the world comes to do business. However, DC is also a temporary transplant community. Almost no one lives their entire life there. Caroline considered it to be an extremely unmagical town. Um, and you talk about how Caroline Casey calls it a hardship
post.
for anybody with eccentricity. And there's a little piece, oh, here, this is what I wanted to read as well. Connecting to the deities of our ancestors makes it easier for the gods and goddesses to reach us and for us to hear them. So let's talk about that a little bit. This ancestral connection is important because humans are less distinct to the individuals, less distinct as individuals to the gods than we realize, and the ones that vibrate to us genetically are the closest to us of all. So this idea that like we have this genetic ancestry to the deity that are as part of our ancestral lineage, but then they were also situated within this, like we were just talking about, this pantheon of various or multiple pantheons of various deities that are around us.
Well, first of all, one of the benefits that I had in terms of the spirits of the land in Maryland, because all of DC is from land that was Maryland land. And all of the parts of DC that were the parts of DC that were part of the nation's capital before the Civil War were taken back by Virginia, just so everyone knows that little factoid. My family were, or at least my father's family, the Kenner family, came to Virginia through Jamestown and then went to the eastern shore of Maryland. Kent Island was the first place in Maryland settled by European invaders. And so that was like an hour and a little bit from where I was born. So my family, even though they didn't stay in Maryland and they mostly went to Virginia after that, I come from a family with really deep roots in the mid-Atlantic region. So on the spirits of place part, that's really good and helpful. The second thing is, one of the things that about the gods of your genetic ancestry, first of all, none of us are like actually a single note of ancestry, as we've all found out by doing, or as many of us have found out by spitting in the little vial. So like, it's very important to avoid white European nationalism. And I want to caution people to talk about that for a moment, because if you have to think about the consequences of saying that you're only entitled to the gods of your direct ancestry. Another way you qualify for connection with divinity is from past incarnations. And that's one of the strongest influences in my practice. I remember lifetimes in which I was in the Himalayas practicing the kind of Buddhism that His Holiness brings to us in this day and age. And I also think that I have been African many, many times. I visited Africa twice, and I actually met the Orishas in the Museum of Mankind when I was 16 years old. They had, the British had stolen some consecrated shrines of the Orishas. And here's the interesting thing. I mean, this experience really changed my life, to stand in front of consecrated shrines, because I could freaking tell they were looking at me back, but I didn't know how to talk to them. And I didn't really know who they were, but they saw that I was walking again in a meat suit and that I was going to be like possibly one of their people. So I feel that very strongly when I was 16 years old. The Museum of Mankind in England, in London, is the ethnological branch of the British Museum. So the British invaders into Nigeria had taken they'd stolen the consecrated shrines as like cultural art objects. They didn't understand the nature. Those shrines are inhabited by the gods. So I literally went before the gods. Many years later, like 30 years later, Ochosi said to me, the reason you're so close with Ogun is because I didn't see you that first time in the British Museum's exhibit. And I'm like, what? Because at the time I didn't know that the veneration of Ochosi had ended in Nigeria, because his entire city-state was conquered and all of the people were enslaved or killed.
Mm.
So
Mm.
Ochosi only exists in the New World versions of the Ifa derived religions.
Mhm.
And so I thought, wait a minute, I can check that with the British Museum. They keep records.
Mhm.
It was
Mhm.
true, Megan.
Mm.
It was true. I got the program. The man was so flabbergasted
Mm.
that he sent me a copy of the program of the exhibit, which I still
Mhm.
have.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's such a powerful testimony to when we're claimed by the gods and goddesses. It's not really up for debate, and we can try and, finagle our way around it. But I shared a couple of sit and sips ago about the Shakta Tantric who was a white woman claimed by Kali. And she had gone to a depossession shaman, basically
That's what I did.
yeah, so she had gone to someone in that area of North India to try and get Kali out. The practitioner, the exorcist,
Get her out?
for. Well, because she didn't invite her in, and she was like, "Well, I didn't invite you in, so I don't know what we're doing here." And
I think your options are limited once she's in.
especially when it's Kali. Yeah, that's what the exorcist told her. She's like,
Oh, this is a blessing.
yeah, so and that's what happened, is it ended up changing the course of her life, and she had to learn. I mean, this was like 30 years ago, so she had to learn to come into relationship with Kali and make room for her and step into devotional practices with her. But and I think that's true for some of your marriages as well. Maybe we can sort of move in that direction and talk
Sure.
about, you hold a variety of different marriages in like cross pantheon, which is why I think your story is so exciting, because that, it's almost like and I write in the book, I could imagine you talking when you talk about all of your spirit spouses as somebody who's talking about, all of the different people that are in the DC coming together and mixing and mingling, as if you were a diplomat yourself. So
Well, everyone needs a representative in DC, even the gods, realistically.
yeah.
So one of the reasons that it was good to be working with a large group of spirits is that we were doing political magic to work on getting the pentacle put into use and funded fully. But unfortunately, to do that, we kind of needed a combat death, and that's what we ended up getting, and the help of the Americans United Against Separation of Church and State. So the DC pagan community is very high functioning because they can't afford the rents otherwise.
Right.
So we got organized quite early in the process. I've known Orion since the 80s, for example. So, the DC area is full of international people. It's called a third culture city because it's not the culture of America, because there's too many international people there to really be fully American. And it's also not the culture of the people who are coming to Washington for whatever purpose. So it's a third culture city where, there are these tides every 2 and 4 years that bring different people in and take different people out of their jobs, with the election cycle, a greater cycle in the presidential year and a lesser cycle in the midterm elections. So, but my magical practice is wide open because I have an open head policy, is the way I put it. And, divinities, like behind me is an altar to Zeus and Hera. And when I was in Greece, Hera and I developed a relationship and got really close, and I started to understand her a lot better. And she asked me to be her priestess. So she's grossly misunderstood, and all of the jokes about Zeus not being able to keep it zipped make me tired, because if people can't understand that it's his cult spreading across the islands from the Asia Minor, now called Turkey, into the Greek islands and across to the Peloponnese. I mean, that's what that is. He's marrying the goddess of the city-state.
Right.
Right.
which is a whole nother kind of spirit marriage.
Right.
Marriage,
And it's more like conquering than the one I'm engaged in.
yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about your marriages. So what is your constellation of spouses?
Well, first of all, the goddess that I resonate, Freya, is a goddess of love as well as war. She's a very early kind of goddess. And she is operating everything under the rubric of hospitality. She's basically sharing her priestess. So in the Norse Pantheon, there are two families of gods, and Freya is a Vanir god, who were, I think, the original indigenous goddesses and gods of Scandinavia and northern Germany and places like Frisia, and eventually England once the Anglo-Saxons emigrated. But the Norse gods most people think of these days are Odin and Thor, and those are Aesir gods. And I believe they're the invading Indo-European gods, and Freya and her brother Freyr are the indigenous forms of the gods. There was a war fought in heaven about it, as many pantheons have sacred wars between sets of gods. And I think it's a metaphor for human invasion and conquest and colonization. So at any rate, my first experience with Odin is kind of amusing, and Megan knows it, but I'm going to tell you now. I had just left my first husband, and I was miserably in the guest room of my parents' house, which was the basement. And I just suddenly woke up from a dead sleep and just was absolutely sure there was a strange person, possibly a burglar, in my room, which would be ridiculous because there are multiple dogs in the household and they were quiet. And then I sort of sat up in bed very anxiously, and I saw, before he blinked out of his existence as a visual, I saw Odin standing there, and he was standing right next to my altar, which had him on it. And he wanted to make sure I knew who he was. So he showed up looking like a physicist I know, with absolutely wild clouds of hair, a giant bushy beard, one eye very visibly harmed, and a big staff, and both ravens and the wolves. And I'm like, oh my God. It was a totally startling experience, very overwhelming. And he basically said he wanted me to worship him exclusively, but I was already involved with multiple other pantheons at that point, not as a lover, but just venerating the divinities. I'd already been doing goddess work for a long time by then. I mean, I found my first teacher, Andres Corbin Arthen, in the early 80s. So by then, it was the late 80s. So I was already, I was already committed.
Right.
And I'd already been initiated, or no, I would get initiated into Santeria later, and I didn't get it fully initiated. I've only received ceremonies in Santeria. But what that served to do was to open my head and tune it. The necklaces actually tuned my head so that I could hear all of the orishas much more clearly, really, really clearly. And it was a wonderful thing. And it literally happened when my priestess, my madrina, put the first black and red necklace over my head for El Egua, and gave me my own particular El Egua, not just any old El Egua. And the orishas taught me immense amounts about different divinities, because they're so multiple. So Odin shows up in my bedroom and tries to claim me, and I'm not that enthusiastic. And later he says, "You made me wait 23 years to marry me." And I said, "Well, I was busy." And I was busy with other gods, especially the goddess. I'm very goddess oriented. So then he basically said to me, "Hardly any human women have been able to resist me for 23 years, just so you know." So, that's the kind of relationship I have with him. He's very funny. And he turns up with this wild hair, looking like a physics professor who I know and who's married to a friend of mine. And so, I said to him, could you moderate your appearance a little bit? I mean, I love dogs, but I'm not so enthusiastic about the wolves. And I love the ravens, but it's a lot of animals in the bedroom. So he ended up looking sort of like a Scandinavian businessman, which I preferred. And virtually the same thing happened with Papa Legba. I have past life memories of the Haitian Revolution, and in some really dire and frightening ways. And so Papa Legba is a spirit that I began venerating when I guess my child was born. So I began venerating him in the mid 1990s. Papa Legba, this is probably 20 years later, about 10, 15 years ago, Papa Legba turns up and he wants to marry me. So my relationship with Papa Legba is really, really positive, and I love him, and I really work with him a lot, and he's the gatekeeper of our entire magical order. And he shows up in a hat with little pom-poms hanging off of it that looks like a bad taste tango dancer from 1930 or something like that. And I loved the way his face looked, but his attire was too much. And he kind of like a toreador almost, only the hat was wrong. So I look at the scenery, the scene that I'm in the vision, and I'm in a bedroom on top of a bar on a corner, and the bar sign is flashing neon, bar, bar, bar. And I'm like, I don't think we need to be here. I realize that you're the divinity of the crossroads, and it's a wonderful thing, but could we find a quieter place? And so then this is my favorite part. We go to a place that I've been, which is like paradise. It's in Kenya. And in my vision, suddenly he's wearing like a polo shirt and linen trousers, and he looks completely different. He doesn't look fully African the way he did in the corner bar. He looks like he's mixed race. And then he says, honey, two can play at this game. And I realized that I suddenly look, and this is the most Washington part, I look like the gal that accused Clarence Thomas.
Oh, Anita
I
Hill.
look like Anita Hill, except paler. I look like I'm a mixed race Anita Hill, which just shows you what my idea of Black women's beauty is. Beauty and brains in one package is Anita Hill. And we had lived happily ever after on a little place in Kenya on Lake Nakuru. So that's where our temple is, where I go to him.
Thank you. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. That reminds me of when you were talking about how you have different astral temples for your different spouses. So we've talked about Odin and Papa Legba.
Oh, let me tell you about Odin's castle, because this is hilarious.
Oh yeah, I love this.
All right. So Odin is a blacksmithing god. He's a very, very ancient blacksmithing god. And he's also the god of war, or the Orisha of war, the Orisha of blacksmithing. But Ogun lives in different religions and different other African diaspora religions that have various different beliefs about him. And sometimes he has like all gods, sometimes, or like many gods, he has a last name, which gives more information about which emanation of Ogun. But the Ogun that I work with is just Ogun. And he has this giant fortress, and there's a window in the stone wall of the giant fortress. And inside the window is this beautiful bedroom, and it looks like a medieval palace bedroom. And that's where I meet him. But one day he didn't be there when I arrived. So I am insatiably curious, and I opened the door and I went wandering around, and I went down to lower, there were a lot of computers where I was, but once I got to lower levels of his castle, there were more and more war machines down there. And finally, I was looking for the blacksmithing area, and finally he found me and he said, "What are you doing here? You're not supposed to be down here. This is not the part of me that connects with you. Come ahead now, dear." And he led me off to the bedroom, which was lovely.
That's lovely. Yeah. So Papa Legba, Ogun, Odin. Tell me a little bit about Anubis.
The one of the funniest stories about Anubis is, first of all, I was told by one of my spiritual teachers that the Egyptian gods didn't relate to divinity, their divinities didn't relate to humans this way. And I would say that my experience with that has been categorically false. So I was like, very hesitant to even consider such a thing with any of the Egyptian gods. But his mother is the goddess I'm sworn to, his putative mother. And the day that he married me, there was an actual manifestation of divinity. The first thing that happened is I saw an oriole. His colors are gold and black. And I saw an oriole, which is also the state bird of Maryland. And I mean, I've seen an oriole probably fewer than 10 times in my life. So it's like a red freaking letter day when I see an oriole. The next thing was, I know this is ridiculous, but sometimes the spirits talk to you this way. I found the top of a Gatorade, an orange Gatorade with the 2 letters written on it, AB. It's still in my altar room. And then, this is the most miraculous part. It's one thing for me to see an oriole. I got home and my husband had been working the whole time. And Jason said, "There was a bird on the railing outside the window for such a long time. I was so surprised. It was bright orange and black." And he's not a sports fan, so he has no idea what an oriole looks like. So to have an oriole in the forest plus an oriole at the house, it's like, she's not home. Where is she? They sent a new oriole after the oriole at my house didn't find me home. It was my feeling. Anubis did.
And that was like some of these others marriages, I remember you saying that they were sort of like a fait accompli, meaning like you were in a visionary state and there was the deity and boom, you were married, and it was just not
That was Ogun.
up for discussion.
That was like Ogun. He just waved his hand and I was wearing a dress that looked kind of like a 19th century, mid 19th century, with hoop skirts in green with a black velvet collar and like a button placket of black velvet buttons and a black velvet waistband and then little black velvet cuffs and everything else his shade of green. I mean, I was just like, okay.
I guess this is happening now. Yeah, that reminds me of Kama's story in the Shakta Tantric, where it was like she was given a sari and it was clear that Kali was marrying her, and she was like, well, all right, I guess that's what's happening right now. And then you sort of just have to figure out, right? You have to negotiate and figure out. But you pushed back with Odin, right? You negotiated with him for a while.
Well, I was happy to be his lover, but I didn't want to marry him because he's very controlling and bossy. And it doesn't work very well with me, but we worked out a large number of things. And he worked as my spirit guide in a very kind and loving way. And slowly, all of the sort of neo-Nazi ugliness that I had unfortunately been familiar with gave way to understanding him better and on a much deeper level. And he's very mystical. So that's one of the bonds we have together, is that he's a mystic too, which is not like I have several blacksmith allies, but the blacksmiths are not usually mystical in nature. They're usually creative manifestors. So to be with a divinity who's a creative manifester on the non-physical, on the spirit level, is really, really interesting. He's like an initiated god. He's a very interesting god. He's more like Odysseus in the Greek pantheon than most of the other divinities that I can think of. He's pretty unique because I hope everyone realizes Odin is the communication spirit of the Norse pantheon, and he's analogous to Ganesha and Hermes and Elegua. So one of the things you're seeing here is I have repeated resonances with gods of communication, gods of mysticism, and gods of the dead. Sometimes gods of mysticism and gods of the dead are the same. Hermes, for example, who I am not married to, I'm married to Dionysus, but Hermes is the messenger god and the psychopomp. And that's another role I fulfilled for my clients a number of times, is to do the work of psychopomp. So,
Yeah.
and so I have different lovers and different protectors in different ways, different relationships. But my lover in the Greek pantheon is Dionysus, and I resonate with him and Ariadne.
Well, you took me exactly where I wanted to go, which was to talk about the spirit lover and sexuality phenomena. So I'm going to read a little bit about this. Caroline noted that she believes, oh, let me back up a little. The more, this is you, Caroline, you say, the more we can open the door to other forms of religious experience, the better. Spirit marriage is something that has been known in human history for generations, but was suppressed by monotheism. I agreed, and I interjected my belief that perhaps spirit marriage was at the root of all religion and spiritual traditions, even though it's been largely suppressed. Caroline concurred and noted that she believes this suppression is due to the sexual repression within mainstream religion. The erotic energy that the spirits often stimulate in their devotees is seen as dangerous and frightening by traditional religions, and therefore has prevented people from receiving the love the spirits have to give. Opening oneself to being passionately loved by the spirit world requires an unorthodox understanding of sexuality, its purpose, and the esoteric nature of the energy exchange during sexual contact. Caroline goes on to say that the practice of spirit marriage is a challenge for humans, but not for the spirits. The spirits are the ones who practice spirit marriage, and the traditions are the ones who struggle to encompass it. And then here's another quote that you have a little bit later on. The primary reason that we have sexual contact, or what I prefer to think of as metaphoric sexual contact, is because the spirits are empowering me in this way.
Right.
They're doing healing for me, and they're empowering me. Fortunately, my third husband is an experienced shamanic practitioner and understands these practices perfectly well. Some of my friends, people I've trained with, especially people who have happier relationships within monotheism, don't operate this way because they have too much instilled guilt and shame to accept this type of empowerment. They can't take in the kind of love that I can take in from the spirits that I work with in the way that I'm able to, because they still feel guilty and ashamed of their own sexual desires. For Caroline, then, spirit sex is less about good or bad and more about how much are you able to open yourself, body, mind, and spirit, to receive the blessing that working intimately with the spirit has to offer. Yeah, so I loved just this reframing, like, of what's actually going on in sexual intercourse, both with spirits and, you know, even my training as a tantric, I understand that that's a lot of that what's going on even with our human to human sex. There's a lot of transmission and exchange that happens. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about or the empowerment, and particularly there was a story that you had shared about the empowerment and when you were trying to get pregnant.
Odin came to me and told me that I was going to get pregnant. I'd had terrible trouble having children, and I've come to realize that Odin really helped me in having my daughter. I'd already had 2 children. Jason, whatever you're doing, make it stop. Cancel. There. No software update during an interview, thanks. Let me make sure this is dead. Okay. He didn't do anything. It was an automatic thing. All right, let me try and get myself back on track from the demand for a password. We were talking about spirit marriage, and one of the things I wanted to say before I go into the actual answer is, if you go and look at this, the statue that it's a statue of Santa Teresa in ecstasy, and it's in a church in Rome, and she's being stabbed in the heart with a golden arrow. I mean, she's having spirit sex. She just couldn't accept it in her pussy.
Yeah.
That's really the quintessence. I mean, that's where they connect in a lot of ways. I didn't even know I was having spirit sex at first, because the instruction would be, come and sit on my lap and let me comfort you. And afterwards I would feel empowered. So, you know, the spirit sex is very different from physical sex. And, you know, my husband is a computer engineer. So he was also poly for a good number of years with previous partners and at the beginning of our relationship. And so, like, his response is, we don't have to worry about date books or making sure our schedule is going well with our extra lovers because you're having extra marriages while I'm sleeping next to you. So, you know, that was really helpful in having me be more self-accepting. Because my second husband didn't know until I was in the process of leaving him that I was having spirit sex. And I don't think I was married to Ogun by the time I left him. So, you know, I mean, here's what happened with Michael Harner in a training session. A woman had an experience in which she had sex and she didn't describe it, but he made a comment after she shared her journey in class about how they'd probably gone off and had sex in spirit form. And she looked embarrassed and conscious and said yes. And everyone giggled a little bit, like we were in junior high school. This was like 25 years ago. And then here's what Harner said. And this is one of the things that made me not his student. Megan Rose, this made me not his student. I was being taught by him, but I left off being his student when he said this. He said, don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone you're having sex with your spirits. I mean, if look at Goya, Goya knew what the witches did. They were having sex with Pan, with the spirit of Pan. So, like, I thought about it, and he said, you can share the spirit battles you have, all of those fights you have with spirits in which you vanquish them and you make sure that they're purified so they stop harming your client. You can talk about those, but don't talk about how the spirits love you so much that they want to make love to you. Don't talk about that. And I'm like, that's consensus culture. Fuck that. I'm not doing that. I refuse to participate in that. And that's the minute I became Sandra Ingerman's student. Sandra Ingerman doesn't deal with this issue at all, but she also understands that what we're doing is profoundly revolutionary, and it's not part of the normal paradigm of American culture. It's not part of capitalism. She's coming from a very different perspective. Sandy does not did not ever, as far as I know, do depossession. She does soul retrieval almost exclusively as a healing modality, and is very effective. She's extremely powerful. But, you know, there comes a time when you have to, like, let the rubber meet the road, and life is not all nice. And there's vampires out there in spirit form that infest us in a variety of ways and take the form usually of mental illness states, depression, any kind of perturbation that's constant, and physical illnesses, very much so. So a number of my clients, their physical illnesses disappeared after they had treatments. So, you know, that's what working with spirits can accomplish if people are willing to do it.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, you know, we have such, I mean, we're living right with the inheritance of our Puritan ancestors, right? And just the Puritan culture, right? That
my family was not Puritan. They came into Jamestown for economic reasons, and they were Episcopalians.
Yeah.
So,
So, but that culture, or even in some ways the Victorian culture,
right.
that it just is so afraid to talk about sex. I mean, this came up with when I was talking to the ceremonial magician about knowledge and conversation with the holy guardian angel, and how marriage isn't an incorrect understanding of what's going on there, but they sort of shy away from that in that tradition, because that there's all these sort of erotic sexual implications, and the idea is, at least as I understood what he was sharing, was that you don't have sex with your divine self. And I was like, well, that's odd. That sounds very Victorian to me, because we can have sex with ourselves, and why wouldn't we have an intimate bonded relationship with our divine self? And what are we even really talking about, as you said, when we talk about sex, right? Because it's much more of this energetic activation, transformation, and attunement that's happening. At least in my experience, it has been, and in many of the people that I talk to. Orion even talks about, like, when Bree kind of comes onto him, it's not his genitals that get aroused, it's his whole nervous system that comes into
That's right.
process.
And it's a product of the divinity matching chakras with us, as far as I can tell. So that they're sharing directly between the various energetic chakras, and the communication is far more intense than it is with another human most of the time.
Yeah. So it's an empowerment or a transmission, and it's not about, and as you said, there are deleterious entities out there. We won't go into the incubi succubi, but there are beings that sort of drain us of that energy. But in the frame of spirit marriage, right, we're doing our due diligence, we're getting to know them, we're dating them, we're making sure who they are, right, we're before we agree to step into some of the deeper at least in in an ideal situation. And actually that sort of takes us into one of the things that I wanted to cover with you, which is divorcing a spirit, right?
Right.
Sometimes that might need to happen if we have been sort of apropos of nothing forced into or launched into a spirit marriage, and that's it's not working out, right?
Right. So quite some time ago at this point, let me try and remember when it might have been. It was in the late 90s. I took my daughter to Louisiana, and I went to the swamp to see. This was before Katrina, because the trails I walked on, the boardwalks, were completely destroyed during Katrina. Anyway, my cousins and I walked on these alligator and snake infested boardwalks. It was really, really interesting. And then we went to a wonderful restaurant that had a gift shop, and I bought an unconsecrated head of elegua. I should not have bought it. It spoke to me and said, "Buy me, please." So I bought it, and it was a mistake. It was an inhabited head, as you've guessed. And I would go up and meet his astral temple. He would do things like he would grab my chin. That's the kind of thing that made me nervous about him. He would grab my chin and say, "Don't call me by any of those other names," because I was so ignorant at that point. I wondered, I called him Papa Legba. I thought he was Papa Legba, and he wasn't at all. He said, "I'm Elegua, not Papa Legba." So he was very handsome. He was always dressed as a Nigerian, in traditional garb. He looked fantastic. He was so gorgeous. And the place he lived in was in the lower realms of the astral upper world. And it had a black and white. He was a black and white Elegua, not a red and white Elegua. There's different colors that represent him. And Papa Legba is white and red. So those are the three colors that Elegua has in his character. And this one was the black and white one. I never knew his extra name. He was unbelievably handsome and an amazing lover, but he also frightened me. And I can't be in relationship of that kind if I'm frightened. He was very precipitous and passionate, and he got mad at me and did things, so that there are manifestations of his anger in my life. And that scared me too much, because here's the truth. I'm a transitional practitioner. I'm not traditionally trained in a normal way, the way someone would be if they were a culture member of his culture and a culture or cultural origin is what I mean. And I don't know the etiquette well enough not to make mistakes. So the divinities I work with have to be forgiving of me and my mistakes. I have ADHD and I'm like, oh, let's start with step 3. And then, we missed step 1 and 2. Let's go back and start at 1 again. And then we'll do 3. Oh, whoops, there's 2, and I also am a kind of person who can manage to attract enough people to help me so that I've been able to be quite effective in a whole number of different realms in the pagan community. Like you didn't mention Jason's and my tarot company, which we recently sold, but we had a tarot and oracle card app company up until October of last year. The deal closed on November 1st, and 3 of our friends bought the company from us. So, we had 100 decks on Apple and Google, which offered different experiences with cards. And, that's got a lot of balls in the air right there. You have to work with graphic designers. So one of the things that gods have done is they've mitigated some of my ADHD problems, quite frankly. And I operate as a committee. And here's one of the things: I have executive functioning issues. Guess who's head of the committee and the committee chair? Athena. Athena is the guardian of my college, Bryn Mawr College. So in addition to loving her very dearly, she's willing to help me be better at organizing tasks, because that's my big problem. So it's not just that I have spirit lovers. I have all kinds of different spirits who play different roles in my life. For example, Abraxas contacted me out of the blue, and I just had no idea. And I said to him, I thought you were a Santana album. And he responded, look me up on Wikipedia. But I've never found any kind of written information that helped me understand him better than being with him, because as a demiurge, he's really hard to pin down. So I don't have a visual on him. I have a shifting series of black and white things, and sometimes I can see him in his traditional form with a rooster's head and snake legs, but that's kind of a disturbing form, frankly, especially a disturbing form and feeling not quite really up close and cozy with someone like that. So the Elegua, who frightened me, I eventually decided I just had to do something about it, and I couldn't let the situation fester. So what I did was I asked Obatala to convene a meeting of the Orishas, and I formally petitioned Obatala to divorce me from that Elegua, that emanation of Elegua, because I was frightened of him and I didn't feel comfortable working with him because of the way he'd punished me several times when I made a mistake. And basically the spirits I work with have to be more patient with me than that.
Yeah, I think that's such an important story to share, because that, a lot of these stories that I collected, they were like, well, you're married and it's a lifetime or multiple lifetime kind of thing. And I think it really depends on the spirit, right?
Oh yeah.
Orion's journey to be able to be indwelled by Bree, which was this 7-year, journey to be able to interface with her. He talks about how that's for forever, because his nervous system had been completely rewired by her. But I think some of these other beings, depending on their function in the pantheon that they sit in, we have that kind of agency, just like you were being able to push back against Odin and no, I'm not ready to marry you yet, and in my own story, I had a spirit showing up wanting to marry me, and I didn't know enough about him. I'm like, well, you're gonna have to woo me, and we're gonna have to date for quite a while before I say yes to this. And it was great. I mean, that's what what precipitated my dissertation research, because that was all of this inquiry to try and figure out who the spirit was that wanted to marry me.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm just be looking at time, and I want to be mindful. We do have some questions. So I wanted to talk really briefly about the benefit and outcome of the marriages. And this is just one of my favorite quotes from your story. You said, "This is what Odin says. The ability to be psychic will be just as determinative of who goes forward in evolution as the ability to speak was when the species began." And you talked about how we shifted from Homo neanderthalensis to Homo sapien, and how we're sort of at this cusp of moving into our next evolution as a species. And I'm curious how spirit marriage, in your mind, relates to that.
It also relates to the ancestors. And I just want to say one thing, which is I don't think that humans evolved out of Neanderthals at all. I think we have had like, here's the thing. When I read the stuff about the Neanderthal traces in the European genome, I'm seeing rape, rape, rape. I'm seeing rape on both sides. So people are like, oh, we married Neanderthals. Yeah, like hell we did.
Mm-mm.
They raped us when they could catch us. They would kill the men and rape the women, and that's normal in human culture. I'm sorry. The ancestors want to help us get beyond, and the spirits and the gods want to help us get beyond this very, very potent pivot point in time. We're on the pivot point of destroying all life on the planet. And the gods and the ancestors are mobilizing to try and get people to grow up, because right at the moment, this at the State of the Union, nothing could prove my point more abjectly than the hooting of those two howler women monkeys from the GOP, MTG and Lauren Boebert from Colorado, MTG from North Georgia. Honestly, we have to get beyond nuclear weapons, and we have to figure out our energy needs without destroying the planet and ruining the entire ecosystem of the whole planet. It's just a terrifying moment, and that's why there's so much spirit activity right now. We're on the cusp of the Aquarian age, and we're trying to get away from our violent past. And until we look squarely at the shadow side of our violent past, we cannot go forward clean. And this, for instance, is a good example of critical race theory arguments. The people who want to suppress critical race theory are the same people who want to suppress Black people in public life and in our economy. So until we get past absolute bullshit like that and learn to be better and a more mature species, we aren't going to be able to move forward, because we're so heavily armed at this point. We're going to destroy everything. So that's why there's so much spirit activity, and people are having experiences. The other thing happens. This is something Ivo Dominguez teaches. In the Piscean age, we could cut a door into other worlds, and the nature of Pisces is mutable water. So the doorway would eventually fill up and be obliterated just by natural forces. We're moving into an era of fixed air. We cut a doorway, a portal, and it's not going to just be fixed by fixed air. It's just going to linger. So magicians of all nations and varieties, please remember that when you're making portals. Be sure to shut the door after you open it. When you're finished, shut the door. So that's what I believe. I believe that the ancestors and the gods are in a huge mobilization effort, both to come back from monotheism, from the suppression of monotheism, and also to help us into a greater degree of maturity as a human species.
Wonderful. Yeah. I'm going to read one final quote and then we'll go to questions. This is you talking about working with the spirits. So working in harmony with the spirits is the way to physical, mental, and emotional health. In my experience, with the spirits being the senior partner of the union, I truly believe our spiritual bodies precede the level of our physical bodies. Our physical bodies take their cue, at least in part, from our spirit bodies. If you're constantly being healed on a physical level because you're being healed on a spirit level, this is part of the gift spirit marriages bring people. It's not just additional magical power, it's physical healing, well-being, and the feeling of being loved, and everything that intimacy on a human level brings, intimacy on a divine level also brings. One of the most important points Caroline emphasizes repeatedly in our conversation is how healing and regenerative a spirit marriage can be. She emphasizes how our fear of sexuality and intimacy often lead to disease in our bodies, minds, and spirits, and how opening to the spirits can help us heal this. So, and any comments on that? I mean, there's so much more that we could share. We didn't even get to like talking about how you keep all the voices straight when you've got your committee going on.
It's usually pretty obvious who's talking to me.
Yeah. And then also, oh, I went super blurry there for a second. Let me see.
Yeah, you're still blurry on my end.
Can I get, there we go. Come back into focus. Thank you. So, and then, I wanted to talk a little bit about the tattoos and the ceremony, but y'all are just going to have to buy my book and read the full text of Caroline's story. Is there anything that you'd like to say in closing before we go to questions, Caroline?
Just about the healing. Like many people who are spiritually very active, I had a giant health crash in about starting 11 years ago. And the way I've recently gotten a handle on it, and I can't believe that it's actually working for me, because I've been very sick for almost a decade, for more than a decade. And it was my food. It was not metaphysical. So if if you're doing everything right on the spirit level and you're eating things that your body can't metabolize at all, you're going to get sick no matter how pure your spirit is. This is not a game of spirit alone. This is a game of an integrated being who exists on a number of different levels. Yeah. And the physical also has to be supported in a good way.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think that was also one of the benefits of having a genetic connection to some of the deities that you work with, because they can reach through to you in a way that maybe.
Anubis is really good at healing. So are I have a jinn lover, and he came as a healer, and his name is Ahmed. I think that's so sweet. So I don't agree with that. I think the spirits can heal anyone they please. And like your past life resume has a lot to do with what spirits you attract. And that's not a physical type of thing, So I had a lifetime in which I lived in Yemen, oddly enough, and I was Nabatean. And those are the pagan people before Islam in ancient Arabian Peninsula people. And they were very technologically sophisticated and multi-pantheoned. They're the ones who built the tomb of the temple of the rock with the meteor in it. That's the most sacred place, the Kaaba in Mecca. So, I have a really great relationship as a healer. He comes to me and he's my lover too. I'm not married to him, but he's a delightful presence. And I work with three goddesses of the jinn of the ancient Arabian pantheons. So, I don't think that you have to have a genetic worship component, your ancestors worship these gods component to healing. Definitely not in my case anyway.
Yeah.
I don't have any Greek blood either.
Yeah, I think maybe I misspoke. I was talking about a part in your story which I didn't read tonight, that where you talked about how Odin was able to reach you at a time when other deities couldn't. Right. So that's what
my whole body was shutting down.
Right.
That's why he was able to reach me. Is like I couldn't have spiritual experiences when I was really sick because I was too sick. So absolutely right about that.
Yeah. So you can read all of Caroline's story in my book that's coming out on the 5th. And I also have a new website that I just launched. I'm going to put it in the comments right here. that is spiritmarriage.com, and you can go to it. And I've got a special offer for people who buy my book on the day that it comes out. And for those of you who have stuck around to the end, this week I'm announcing the launch of my Sit and Sip with Dr. Megan Rose Facebook group. So it's a free public group where folks can come meet and chat with other folks who are interested in spirit marriage, as well as any of the other topics that we've unpacked in these Sit and Sips, like animism or reenchantment or ecosexuality and more. So I'm going to put a link in the Facebook group or in the chat right now, so that you can go and join the Facebook group if you so choose. And for those that are watching this as a replay, you can just go to Facebook and search group Sit and Sip with Dr. Megan Rose, and you should be able to find it there. All right. Thank you, everybody, for staying till the end. Next week, you can tune back in Thursday, March the 10th, 5 o'clock Pacific, 8 o'clock Eastern, and we're going to talk about the story of the New Orleans Voodoo Mambo. So Caroline and I are going to stick around and answer some questions now. For those who have questions, let's see. I had seen a hand raised earlier. It looked like it was someone else, but Elise, if you want to, you have your hand raised, so if you want to unmute yourself, and take your video off, or you can type your question into the chat and we will do our best to answer it.
That's pretty funny because I didn't mean to raise my hand.
Oh dear.
Let me unraise it.
Yeah, you can, I think there's a button to lower hand. All right. Anyone have any questions? Elise did make a comment that she had taken classes with Ingerman. Thank you so much for speaking about this. It was hard for her to accept all of the same things. Thank you. You confirmed.
It's very, very frightening at first because you don't know what's happening. We don't have a cultural tradition of it.
Yeah, yeah. And yet there's absolutely precedent for it, you know, transculturally. From the Bernini statue, the St. Teresa statue that you were talking about, and the Beguines, you know, I talk about this in my history section of the book. Like, these kinds of erotic experiences with spirits have transcultural precedent.
Right. Very ancient also.
Yeah, yeah. Part of the sacred marriage and the Hyros Gamos tradition. I mean, it's there in spades. All right. Any questions, comments? And if not, we will sign off here in a second. Thank you, everyone, for sticking around.
Thank you for coming, and thank you for having me, Dr. Megan Rose.
Thank you so much, Caroline. You have been such a wonderful ally. Oh, there's Avnis. Avnis, feel free to ask your question.
Sorry, I know you were leaving, but really quickly, some comments on what happens when your spirit marriage like moves sometimes into a more of a parental thing. And it's almost like you've got your, you know, spirit beloved spouse, and then there's this parent relationship coming in. And that's weird for me. And I know these all serve all kinds of purposes, but can you make a comment about that, please? Thank you.
Is
Are you
that
asking
me?
Caroline or I, or
Either one.
Well, I don't really have a parental style relationship with Odin because I'm too argumentative, basically. So, you know, basically Odin has tried to manipulate me in a number of ways, and I've been very resistant about it. And in fact, I ended up having I ended up finding out that Odin and Loki had a bet about me, which really pissed me off. So I don't have any experience with them as a parent. But what happens to me with other spirits where they act as a confidant sometimes, and then in a more parental role, and it's always goddesses who do this. So I don't have the sexual dynamic with them at all. What happens is they become a different looking emanation of the same divinity when they're playing a different role. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. That is helpful. Thank you.
That felt good.
I think that goes back to the point also that we can negotiate with them, right? We can negotiate for how they show up, right? And how
Right.
they, and we can be like, okay, if you're going to show up like this and be in a parental role, then only show up that way for the parental role, or something that's similar to it. And if we're going to have more of an erotic contact, then it needs to be in a different sort of form. I have a similar thing going on with with the goddess, with my divine self, where there's this very parental kind of energy, or just this loving emanation kind of energy. And also there is the feeling of when she arises in my body, like my kundalini rises, right? And there's
Right.
this like coming out of me kind of energy. And I guess I've always seen it as like fractals, or like a mandala, where there's sort of the quintessence of the energy, and then there's all these different arrays of how that sort of emanate out from that, and how the different faces or the different guises that the deity that we're working with can wear. And that sort of reminds me of, we were going to talk about true forms, Caroline, and how they can have multiple true forms. And so kind of like there's all these different forms of Kali.
Right.
Maybe one of the forms that you're working with can be in a kind of parental capacity, and another form can be in a more lover capacity, and it might be nested within the giant umbrella of the deity, but they're sort of like different emanations.
It's like constellations instead of single stars.
Exactly.
And they're all still the divinity, but they have many different faces and many different emanations. It's one of the things we need is better education as polytheists, because we've been impressed for years by consensus culture that divinity is a single note, and it's just false.
Exactly.
This is helpful. I do feel experience several different forms, but I hadn't thought of like saying, can you please like make that one be that thing? Because it's a little confusing. So thank you very much for letting me ask that question.
Negotiate over it. You'll do fine.
Yeah.
Just get to where you're comfortable.
Right.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I wanted to see Frith's cat. Frith had her cat. Can she turn on her? Do you still have your cat? Oh, good.
Yay. Is that Pogo? Yeah.
Oh, lovely.
That means he's comfortable with me.
Very. I
All
had to
right.
bring the dog's bed over so he wouldn't mob me during the interview. Thank you so much, Megan. Thank
you, everyone, for showing up tonight. Thank you, Caroline, for being part of this project and an ally and a support in this research. And I look forward to seeing you all next week when we talk about the New Orleans tradition of voodoo.
Can I say one thing, last thing?
Yeah, take us out.
I have a tarot deck coming. It's in final edits. The book is in final edits. I wrote the book, and the lady who did the cards is she's a designer in a major Washington, D.C. area federal museum system. We can't say which one, but I think I've been fairly clear. And her art is just incredible. The deck has had an app on the Fool's Dog with very brief card meanings, and now it's about to have a whole book. So we're hoping by Beltane we'll have a Kickstarter.
Oh, yay. Yeah. And just so folks know, how do they find the Fool's Dog Tarot that has like
Foolsdog.com.
Foolsdog.com.
Or look on the Apple Store or Google Play.
Yeah, you can find Fool's Dog. It's fantastic. I have a few decks from that are wonderful to have on the go. My iPhone. All right, everyone. Mwah. Sending you all much love. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you back here next week. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye, Caroline. Bye, Megan.
Bye. Lots of love.